What's up, Errol? Okay, nice to meet you for our next podcast. It's just you and me today, from what it seems. So, miss you, George, if you're watching. But we can definitely talk about a lot of things that are maybe more technical. Not so technical that like we'll just like go in, but I don't know. Where do we start off? Do you have any sort of questions? I have a lot of topics, but I don't really know what to parse through.
Uh, well, it's funny that you just mentioned parsing because we're just talking about that. I mean, yeah. Do you want to do like the questions that you have? Is it more on like the details, or is it a little bit more holistic?
I have a little
What?
bit of both. I think it like one of the things that I'm really interested about is two splitting questions, which is like respecting design and then respecting standards inside like your code base. But
Mhm.
obviously, like there's ways to talk about specifically, and there's ways to talk about that generally. It's still to me not like super clear. I always think that like if you're part of a big company, you will learn how to like do proper standards, proper like ways to do these things to manage. But given that we have separating experiences where I'm more of like an indie developer and now you're like in a company with probably like much more standards than I am used to, I'm wondering if like there is any sort of advice or any things that you have learned in that regard.
Mm.
That's like what I'm
Mm.
interested in talking about, but I don't know if that's what you want to talk about. We can talk about like
Yeah,
whatever you want.
yeah. Let's do that. Well, first though, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
About design and the technical execution of it.
Okay.
So you come from you were a very strong designer at Coopside with us.
Yeah.
And now you're doing a lot more software engineering, super
Yeah.
cool.
Right.
And I am curious because you now have the design aspect of working on whatever on Figma and then now implementing it. Do you think that the Figma design should always be exactly as it is in the app? Or do you think the developer is able to push back and say, this is very difficult to design? This is maybe not how we currently do things. What do you think the balance is? Do you think the Figma is always priority, make it as close to it as possible, or do you think the developers can actually push back a little bit and say no, it's just not possible to implement this way?
So this is a great question because I think there's been a lot of experience that I've myself uncovered. Um, I guess the bottom line, I'll start with the bottom line and then I'll like branch into the details, right? I think at the end of the day, design is about what you can do to advance the impression of maybe an interface, whereas like the coding aspect is really just these are the constraints of the interface. Realistically, if you have a really great designer and a great programmer, they will find what is like really pushing the bounds, but also constrained enough to actually have it be exactly the same. The problem in practice, though, is that most designers don't really know what those constraints are. And for coders, they're I won't say they're not explorative enough, but they also like are kind of set in, oh, like let's just do the easiest thing possible rather than what
Mm-hmm.
would be the coolest interface to do, right? So yeah, I can go into more of that. I would say now that I've looked at Coop site design, I actually went back to the Figma files like a while back, like
Oh
just
no.
cleaning out a couple of things and everything else. And obviously looking at like what was our actual mockups and what was actually programmed and stuff like that. I think like again, like it's not to say that if you can't do it then like then it's all like it just all goes to shit. Like I'm not saying that designers and programmers they have to be always like adverse to each other, but I noticed that like when I was doing these designs there wasn't really a great like understanding of where these constraints lied, because to me it's kind of like anything I would throw on this page, on this design, on this Figma could possibly be like correctly rendered on the screen uh for what do you call it for the actual code, right? But the constraints I would say is actually like the large scale architecture for layouts, stuff that has to do with like positioning because everything is responsive, um everything that has to do with again like what would this button do if it were to like move in a certain way. And then also
Mm-hmm.
like you don't address things like maybe animations or any of these extra things that like designers don't necessarily think about, because all they're really focused on is like just showing something that like kind of makes sense intuitively, right?
Mm.
Yeah. The other part to this that like designers don't really address, and I'm like, maybe this is a lesson that I got off CoopSite. And this is a lesson that I've learned like not recently, but like by looking at a lot more software. We tend to kind of think about in design how to keep on reproducing results such that it makes it very intuitive for the user to like click on certain places or like to know where to do things. And realistically, I think the Kupse design that like I was looking at, my old designs, the critique to myself was that like every page you basically could do a lot of different things. So like you could sign out, for example. You
Mhm.
could sign out on every page. That to me like sounded good in practice, but then you realize that like pages have like really prime real estate on where you want to place things, right? And you only have so much finite space. So if you don't really respect the finite space by which you actually design these things, or rather you just only place one thing in a certain page or a certain place, it actually confuses the user journey and what to do. And that's something to like constantly recognize. Designers and programmers alike, they don't like think about that until it's like maybe too late or they have to like reconfigure or redesign.
Mm.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, yeah, that was a very interesting perspective. And you would say that the communication between the two teams is really what's vital to kind of for the engineers to explain, yeah, these are the constraints, and for the designers to be like, okay, within these constraints, this is the best way in terms of UI and UX to execute on,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the reason I'm curious about that is because something I'm seeing, not just with just my own experience, working at a few startups, it's
Mhm.
there's always been these disconnects between not just like the engineers and the design team, but the engineers and like other teams as well, whether it's like the
Yeah.
PM side, whether it's the stakeholders involved. There's always been these kind of disconnects. And what I what I found was a lot of the time the engineers would actually have the priority say in pretty much anything, whether it's a feature release, whether it's something design, whether it's something, obviously like technical implementation, but it was always be the engineer's decision. And I don't know, like it has always been a very interesting thing to me because it seems to give us more power than I think we really deserve as engineers. If that makes
Mhm.
sense.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it could be like again, it depends on the experience of the engineer.
Mm-hmm.
Um Engineers can go so far as to say, okay, nothing is possible except for these things because we're so constrained, right? But I would say the better the engineers try to figure out, well, we have to probably hack it this way or hack it that
Mm-hmm.
way, and then like figure out a ways to which we can actually maybe get to a middle ground, if you will. Obviously design would need to follow suit if the constraint is so hard to the point where it's just not possible, then it generally is like the design needs to yield, right?
Mm.
But it's just like the problem with a lot of this is that I don't know. I look at design and I'm not saying that every app is garbage. I just think that a lot of apps that we usually use, not every one of them, but a lot of them that we use, they sometimes do fall into that rut of like, okay, here's like either what's standard or here's what other people do, and then we're just gonna copy off that rather than think about like really new design
Mhm.
or anything else. And it's actually like a point of contention within designers as well, because there's like this whole guideline of user experience and user interfaces where like people generally make apps the same way over time because there's a
Mhm.
way to train people to be like, well, if you use this app and use this app and you want to like use and figure out how to navigate between the two, they generally should have the same sort of like experience because if you're building an app off of something else, or like let's say these are usually what apps look like, and then you build something completely different, it throws people off and they're like, this is just bad design because they're not used to it. Um,
Mm.
right. But I think that again, there's a lot of really great, I would say, designer coder people that are like in both of the spaces. They somehow find a way to do much more and change that layout, and yet it still feels intuitive. So I personally think that the best software that I have ever used, and I've realized this over using it over time, like a
Oh,
lot
can I
more.
guess? Can I guess?
Yeah, sure. Go for it.
Is a Notion?
Yeah, it is. It is Notion. And the thing about that is just like it's not the best software. I'm not saying that it's completely perfect, but like it's kind of like it starts off as a simple page. That's the starting point, right? And then you kind of do building blocks to actually make it like stupidly complicated. And yet the navigation still makes a lot of sense, and the navigation doesn't break as you start to learn how to use it more and more, right? To a first timer, I understand that would probably be confusing, but when you start to compare it to all its alternatives, like even Google Drive, I swear to you, like just a couple like days ago, I made a Google form,
Hmm.
and I put it in a folder, and I couldn't even find that file because I made another file like a couple months back that were titled almost the same thing. And so like I thought I found the file and then I didn't find the file. Like it's just really confusing to navigate, and it doesn't
Hmm.
help that like all of it is really built on constraints that maybe the user themselves doesn't like. They were never going to do things in a weird way. Like I know that I probably use Google Drive in a weird way, and I probably use Notion in a weird way. But it's creating that flexibility and navigation that people don't like recognize is great design until they start building their own systems and it still works.
Hmm. Yeah, it's you made a very interesting point of, doing what the consumer or when the what the user already knows, just so it's the most intuitive for them. And that's why we
Yeah,
see a lot of copy and paste of the same layouts, same design principles, same pretty much just apps, just the actual information is different, like the data itself, right?
right.
And honestly, like I agree with you, man. Like Notion is really okay. This is turning into a little bit of a Notion ad, but Notion is very intuitive. But what I love about them, and I don't think any other product or service I've used is similar in this regard, but Notion is very easy to pick up on and learn the basics.
Yeah,
But at the same time, they have so much advanced functionality for
right.
these advanced users who maybe have been using it for months now, years now, like you, that
Yeah,
it appeals to everyone. It appeals to beginners where it is not a massive learning curve, but at the same
yeah.
time, the advanced users can be like, yeah, like this makes so much sense to me. Like I love using it. And just like a really good example is like something like this isn't really a product, but League of Legends. If anyone
Right.
knows the video game, something the big issue about League of Legends is it's been around for such a long time that the only people that honestly still play it have been people who've been playing it already for years. But as a
Yeah.
newcomer, you come in and you're like, this shit is so advanced to me. There's how many fucking characters? 120 or some shit.
Mm-hmm.
There's
Mm-hmm.
so much going on that it's
Right.
just because it doesn't appeal. It's not intuitive for beginners now. They've already
Yeah.
kind of been set in stone for the more advanced features just because they've been around for longer. But
Mm-hmm.
Notion still, once again, has the idea of let's appeal to the people who are just starting out. It's very intuitive to them, but also intuitive to the more advanced users too.
You bring
I
up a
wish more
good
companies
point.
would like that.
Yeah, I find it interesting, and this is something that I'm actually like actively researching. So maybe it's like a great segue to a different topic in
Mm-hmm.
entirely, maybe about design. One of these like things I was watching, I don't remember who, so unfortunately I can't accredit like this idea, but I was watching like some sort of YouTube video about like what makes great design really great and what makes great products really great, like the digital products. And this like woman was talking about how at the end of the day, like the great products that you usually see have some sort of gamification process where
Yep.
there's a great like clear picture of how to come and start and then like become a very great super user, right? So like she gave the example of Slack. You start off with like, okay, it's just like every other text messaging platform, but then you start to realize that wait, there's actually way more to it. There's like the ability to
Mm-hmm.
not just the channels, but like there's a way to start using these bots. There's a way to start like configuring your workspace. There's a way to start like doing a lot of polling. You know what I mean? Like there's always more on
Yes.
the edge, but you're not like thrown this right on your face. Like here's everything. And
Yeah.
that's actually like where I've always felt some of these walkthroughs kind of breaks that notion, but like it's like if you ever go to a product and like there's like 10 pages of a walkthrough before
Oh
you
yeah.
even start a product. I'm not saying it's bad, but like I've never found that to be a great experience because it's basically showing you every complexity every complexity about the system without realizing like why do I need this now. It didn't like come at the place in which I needed it. It just came before, and I probably would forget it by the time I need to use it. You know what I mean? It didn't
Yeah,
train me to use it. It just kind of just threw me in the deep end and thought that the walkthrough was enough.
right. But don't you, wouldn't a counter argument to even like any sort of walkthrough be if your product needs a walkthrough, it's not simple enough, it's not clear enough. It means you
Yeah.
designed the product pretty shittily. Would you agree with that?
So like shitty product design is like very, I'm sorry, it's actually more of an art than a science. Like if you talk and you listen to really great designers, there's another app that like blew up in the last I guess year, 2 years. It's called Cron, which is actually a design calendar thing that Notion actually bought out as a, as a private sale. They just recently became like #1 Kitty Award for this year for product hunt for an iOS app for their calendar. And that guy, he actually was like interviewed by Gary Tan, the current
Yeah.
president of no, president YC, yeah, a chairman or something like that. Not the Michael Sable. I think is the president. I think he's like whatever is the above, right? I don't know. Like we can look into this later, but he had an interview with Gary Tan, and Gary Tan and him like were just showing how there is a significant like attention to design that like would make people more proactively feel it feels better. So like at the end of the day, when you look at his
Mm,
calendar, I'm not gonna like say it's like leagues better in terms of feature set. When you look at it though, you kind of can see that there's a lot more care or a lot more polish to what he does, and it feels a little bit more intuitive.
mm,
That feeling that a user gets to me is like where you need to go if you want to create good design. It's not supposed to be, okay, here's everything, like let's pray that you know how to use it. It's more like intuition has to line up for a majority of users to justify that it's good design, and that's
mm.
very hard to balance or even to replicate because it's really like lightning in a bottle. Like you can go through
Yeah,
hundreds of iterations, or you can go through like two, and there's no guarantee. It really comes down to like what sort of designs start to make sense and what users say feels correct.
yeah. And it's that feeling that's difficult. I mean, you just mentioned it, right? It's not a science, it's an art.
Yeah.
And like just coming from like as an engineer, it's like fuck, like why can't it just be a science? Why can't we just look at some metrics? Why can't we just implement it X, Y, and Z ways? And yeah, that's the thing, man, is it's all just intuition, like what feels right. And I think the biggest thing about it is just getting consistent user feedback, which I
Mm.
don't know. I don't know who created this app. You said it's called what, Cron
Yeah,
calendar?
Cron calendar.
Cron.
Um
Like a
yeah,
cron job.
it's actually pretty, yeah, exactly, like a cron job. It's really tech, like not technical, but the name is pretty technical.
Yeah.
And he's like a designer and he like came from MIT and all this stuff. It's like crazy, right? Like, but I don't know, the design of like how these products are developed over time is something that I think people are trying to make a science, but it's still not there yet, right? Because at
Mm-hmm.
the end of the day, there are still like some constraints once again to design that dictates good design. So spacing, navigation, this sort of stuff, like, and maybe not having like too many of the same things in the same in different places that then like clutter the interface.
Right.
All of these definitely make it a bit easier for the user. If the user has to think more, then that's not a good thing, right?
No.
So that's why a walkthrough doesn't work, because they have to think about where is everything.
Yeah. It very I don't know if I should share this, but one somebody mentioned to us during Coop site. I don't know who it was. I don't know if it was many people actually, but I remember somebody said you always have to, and this is a very bad I don't know if I should. Yeah, okay, anyways, who cares?
It's Goose Day. I
Some
mean, like whatever.
yeah, but
Yeah.
no, but somebody said you have to treat your customers or your clients like they're idiots, which
No, that's
I
fine. Yeah.
yeah, it's like it's a little bit of a controversial thing because like usually have like the first of all, you can have the utmost respect for your customers,
Right.
whoever's using your product. Because at the end of the day, if they're
Yeah.
using your product or service, you did something right, and they are absolute heroes for doing so.
Yeah.
Especially if they're paying for it. But at the same time, it's that mentality of yeah, you have to treat them because they're like infants when it comes to the app. They don't understand how anything works. if it's not intuitive, if there isn't something that clicks in their mind already, you're it's just a very bad place to be in, because once again, it's an art. It's how are you now actually going to not just only pivot, but how are you going to keep them happy? How are you even going to keep them engaged from the first 5 seconds without having like I don't know. I know like Salesforce and all those other like CRMs, they have these like 20-minute demos. It's and in some cases it might be okay to have if the job and the workflow requires a lot of prepping. But for the most part, yeah, man, like I think just treating your customers as just idiots isn't the right way, but just like infants when it comes to that because they don't understand anything. I think that's a really good mentality to have as long as you don't take it to the toxic level. Um,
Right.
but yeah, I mean, do
Well,
you agree with
even
that
yeah.
or
No, I fully agree with that. Even
okay?
Ivan Zhao, the
Thank God.
CEO of Notion, the way he phrases it is like the way we design has to be we design dumb, right? So
That
like
is the
it
most
means that
respectful way of putting it.
right.
Yes,
It's like
format.
simplicity, right? I'm sure that there's like a whole Apple ecosystem of like, oh, so that mindset of like simplicity is really what you're shooting for. What does simple mean? Definitely means not cluttering too much. It definitely means only having one interaction or one thing to do in a certain place, and it's always going to be in that place, so it never
Yeah.
becomes confusing. Um, those sort of basics kind of like you'll be surprised how many times people break that. Like it's it's actually hilarious. This is maybe again more for like the designer critique in me. It definitely gets misplaced and even like just extended like worser with programmers that might not understand why something is built a certain way,
Hmm.
right? So like I guess for the programmer side, the best thing you can do with a design team is really ask them why they made a design a certain way. Like, why are we navigating this way? Or why are we doing these constraints rather than like just start going and like listing your constraints? Because perhaps with your perspective, you can start to realize, wait,
Mm.
this is like something we can do. We can use like this thing instead. And that does require a lot more like knowledge about the types of components that would be pretty common in an application. So an example of this is like breadcrumbs. They're not the greatest way to navigate, but in certain circumstances, they really work when you're really nested in on like certain pages, right? I don't know if like people know what breadcrumbs are. Basically, they're links with a slash for like anytime you go into a page inside a page inside a page, right?
Hmm.
Um, for a designer, sometimes they might not even consider using a breadcrumb. They might just consider like having this really clunky like first navigation system where you click on the first thing and then you have a tab thing which you click on that and then inside there's
Mm.
another tab system and then a drop down and like it's like okay I get that that might be fine, but it also can get to the point where you're like so into the page there's not even much space anymore. It would have been better if you just had one liner on the top that was the breadcrumb, right? Like
Yes.
that saves so much space and it makes the design better.
Yeah, and that's something as well that's always it's going back to a point earlier about having this kind of really clear communication with not just like the engineers and the design team, but the design team has to always get other people's feedback for it because they would just be like, hey, like we can do it this way and this way looks very pretty, but they could just be missing something very obvious. Same thing with the engineers too. Engineers, in my in my own experience, a lot of times engineers just like to put in the most innovative new stuff into an app without really ever thinking about design or how it's going to actually affect the customers. Like if
Yeah.
you like, I really want to know the amount of developers that have already advocated for adding Chat GPT into the applications, because I'm sure there's not really any reason for it, but I'm sure the developers all across the world have been always going to like the PMs, the tech leads, being like, hey, we should implement it, just because it's
Yeah.
a new technology and it's fun to work with. But you need people who aren't in the same domain as you to be like no, or to be like I don't understand what the hell you're doing. And that's something that's once again it comes down to communications, which I mean I think oftentimes as long as you have just a good culture and you at the very least respect the other teams, which I hope if you're working with them you do,
Right.
then you should be fine. But that's always been a pretty big issue, is always just making sure you have the best communication possible. You're always open to feedback and just continuing to iterate and not being too defensive about your ideas, whether it's,
Yeah.
implementing ChatGPT or making a design extremely, I don't know, sexy, but essentially breaking every single engineering constraint there is, which I've also
Yeah.
seen.
It's
a little
very
bit ago.
interesting for Chat GPT, because when you okay, I'm not gonna say Chat GPT. I think the most recent is actually like Bing's chat
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
interface, right? Like I'm very like not skeptical to design, but I'm also kind of like a little bit I'm at odds with it. Not that it's bad. It's just okay. So I don't know if like contextually you've ever like seen at least the demos of the thing. So you basically go to the new Bing. I don't think it's released yet, but you go to the new Bing and then there's like a tab that goes to chat, right? So like you have general
Mhm.
search and then you have chat. Then you go to chat and it's like almost the same interface as like OpenAI's ChatGPT like website, right? Where you just type your questions and then it'll give you blobs of text that are answers, like almost like a text message, right? And inside the text message, there will be almost like think of like Wikipedia. So you have hyperlinks like all over the text with like the links to the places, right? Um, that seems good, but I'm really curious, like, will people like from a design perspective even like really go forward to click on those links? Because it's not like you need to anymore. The answer is already there. But at the same time, it's like the only contextual thing to like guide them to show, hey, this is where we gotta research. So I don't know like if that's a great
Mm.
design. It certainly doesn't throw too much at the user, so at least that's good. But like, is that really the way in which people should interface with the web? Is that really the way that like would be the best way to understand even from an advertiser point of view, like this is how we want to show our content to people.
Yeah.
I don't think there's ever going to be places or times where like these innovative technologies will like hit design right off the bat. It's just not possible. And
Mm.
even Chat GPT is not like, ignorant of that.
Right. That's you mentioned as well, like designing the web now, because now it's completely innovative. The game is changing. Google's essentially monopoly with I don't know, was it 93% search market share?
Something crazy. Yeah.
Something crazy. It's close to 90, if not more. But that's a very interesting thing because people are now completely rethinking how we interact with the web. And there's
Yeah.
not many times in history where you can have your input on something that could change essentially the world at this degree. So it'll be very interesting to see what Microsoft and I guess ChatGPT. Well, I mean, what's it called? Do they call the chatbot Bing? Do you know?
They just call it new Bing, but the model that was actually used for this is I think it's like internally called Sydney, but I don't really
Mm,
know if there was like a equivalent. I think they just call it like Chat GPT Bing because they
yeah,
like know it's kind of or Bing Chat or what I don't know. Like I don't think there's a
Bing
name
Chat,
yet. Yeah.
Bing Chat. Also, just
Yeah.
like kind of pivoting just slightly. What are your thoughts about
Yeah.
that?
On what do you mean specifically?
Specifically, what are your thoughts on about Microsoft now releasing Bing or New Bing or Sydney or whatever we call it? And
Right,
do
right,
you
right.
think that it's actually something that Google should have a code red for, as I think we touched on a few weeks ago?
Yeah, they definitely should have a code red, but I don't think, at least for me, they should
Mhm.
have a code red in the ways that most people think they should have a code red. I think people like think, oh, this is going to replace search, or search is no longer going to be the way we think of it. Um, and I would say, like, sure, that is a concern. I don't even think the financials really line up right now because, like, realistically, again, for my design critique, if advertisers don't like inevitably get traffic to their websites,
Mhm.
it's all a mute point, right? Like there's no point in really supporting that platform when you need traffic to your site to then do conversions, marketing, all of this extra like work that people have literally made the web for, right? You strip
Mm.
that away, the links themselves, or people needing to go to these links because they already got the answer. And now you're like talking about a whole worldwide shift of like there has to be an equivalent way into marketing these businesses in a chat interface that is already constrained and there's no way these advertisers can control so long as there's ethics and the like Microsoft Bing team realizes like we can't be just like doing sponsored posts all the time of only the top results and that's it, right? Like that doesn't work in this model.
Right.
um so I think the reason why it is a threat, just the bottom line, is that for Google they have to realize that again, people from a user perspective probably want to move forward to this. But for Microsoft, the biggest threat that they have, aside from like losing $11 billion, which is really like nothing to them, is really like finding a way to onboard the businesses and not the users, because the users have already
Ah,
been here. They already on ChatGPT alone, right? And like they got to 100 million users in like 2 months. It's
mhm,
not a question of users really caring. It's a question of how they be able to proceed and monetize on these platforms. And maybe that will be a couple early adopters, but I just cannot see 80% of businesses moving like right now as it is to their place because of the design constraint that it's not promoting the way that you can do it equally. Like at least they mark on Google on the links, hey, this is a
mhm,
sponsored ad, right? This is like something that's on the top results, but you just scroll a
right.
little bit more and you see like what the real diversified answers are based off like a lot of, previous searches, SEO, whatever, right? Um, that doesn't exist in ChatGPT. And so I don't know if there's an SEO equivalent for ChatGPT. And if there is, it has to be done well in a way, like more decentralized way, rather than trying to culminate and really centralize the blob of text or the answer into one place.
Mm,
That's the problem.
right. How would search engine optimization even work?
That's
I
what I'm saying. Like design wise, I can't even think of one. Like
yeah, man. How the fuck would you do that? I actually did not even think about that originally, but I think right now they're in a very early spot. They're just getting, the hype.
yeah.
Microsoft is basically, throwing down and saying like, "Hey, we're here to fuck up Google." This is what we've
So
created. We've had a lot of users on
yeah.
the platform, so it'll be interesting to see what they do going forward. But I think you're right about the businesses. I mean, the businesses will come if there's a lot of users that are either advocating for it. The businesses can make a lot more money, whether the costs are much lower, but it's really costs and users. And I think Chat GPT, not Chat GPT, like Bing, I think they're getting the users right now. And now it's just how do we actually have the businesses make money, whether it's from ads, whether it's from, just whatever search engine optimization they have. I think it'll be interesting to see what's going to happen in the next like year or two, but it's way too early to really say.
Yeah. And I think it's, constrained by design once again, and how like
Yeah.
to make it technologically possible to integrate what we know to be the web to something that should be the web, or easier for the user to use the web. Like there's still a constraint
Mm,
on like maybe the business side over the consumer side. And sometimes those things don't like meet eye to eye. I can totally see like maybe they increase their market share, but I can't like see, oh, Google is going to die like after their
yeah.
their chat is perfected, because it didn't solve the original, okay, how are businesses going to really make money, which is kind of like unfortunately the main spender or the main point of the web being free right now. Right?
Mm, that's true. Or
Like I don't
free in
see
the
other
sense.
people charging subscriptions on chat Bing, right? Like you're not, I wouldn't pay to Bing personally. I rather look over the links, but maybe people that are younger generations would be like, why am I doing antiquated processes? This is like Facebook to Yahoo, right? Like I don't know, like Google to Yahoo, really, right?
Hmm.
But I don't know if that's really true, because design wise, it's not really to me seeing that way. Like I don't see eye to eye with that.
Mm. I don't know, man. It's a very interesting point because if young people, well, first of all, when you mean young, you mean like younger than us, because like we're in our early 20s, right?
Yeah, I'm talking about people that use interfaces differently. Like I do
Yeah,
text, right? I do type text. Some people
yeah.
don't really like type that well. They just use voice memos, right? That's like their way of interfacing.
Wait,
And
really? That's a
yeah,
common thing that people do?
that's a common thing. It's like that's some people only do that, and that's how they communicate, right? So I don't know, like the way that we
Yeah,
digest the web is going to be different than the next generations after, and interfaces could change, right? ChatGPT is
absolutely.
just one of these ways.
Or you can completely just strip design and have one of those like neural networks just embedded in your brain. You can have like a hologram or something that comes up.
Yeah.
That's probably next like 40, 50 years, but
Still needs
maybe
to be
Elon Musk will
designed
get there.
well.
Don't need to be
Which,
designed well. That's very good.
yeah,
Yeah.
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 I
Fair
think it's
enough.
interesting. I like to see the bottom line on like how to really be good on design and programming. I do see that oftentimes, unfortunately, because you focus on the design, if you're a designer, and that's like very creative, and then you focus on the programming. I'm saying it's also creative, but like in a very more logical driven way of like, here's our constraints. and
Mhm.
here's what we can do with our constraints. They're kind of at odds with each other, and the only way to really fiddle with this is to find middle ground. So if you're a programmer, you should learn more about design. You should definitely read some books on like how to use Figma, or even like how do these guys use their tools. And on the other hand, if you're a designer, I'm sure it's more daunting to like say, oh, go learn programming.
Yeah.
But I would say the
Learn to
best
code.
way is probably to look at other websites and depend on designs that have already been proven in the wild, right? If you're not able to program yourself, go to websites that you find inspiration to, figure out why do I as a designer feel this is great, try to
Mhm.
emulate, try to steal as an artist, right? Like great artists steal. And then show, well, like, how are we capable of doing this to a designer? You can at least show, like, hey, I got this idea from here. So I don't know if it's like programmable, but like some other guy did that on this website, right?
Can
It's
we do it?
possible. Can we do it? Right.
Right.
That's better than like just, oh, let me just throw whatever on a page and like hope that it actually is constrained or realistic. That might
Right,
not be
right,
true.
right, right.
Yeah.
Just good communication, and also once again not being too defensive. I think that's definitely yeah. Just I'm just speaking from my own experience just years ago, but I think, yeah, I think you're 100% right in terms of like engineers should definitely be a little more aligned in terms of just designers and understanding their workflow, maybe a little bit more, understanding why they come to the decisions they do. And yeah, it's a little bit of a bigger ask to say designers should learn to code. But I mean, it wouldn't be too bad though. It would be really nice if at the very least they could read up on some just documentation on, whatever design components or component libraries the front end is using or the developers are using.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
like one was like Mantine as well, where if we're using a component library to design an application, there's tons of documentation on it. There's obviously
Right.
the technical execution of it, which the engineers will handle, but the designers can still look into the notes of it and say, okay, like this library implements it this way and this way and this way. They directly say we cannot do this. So I think it's just like a nice balancing act of maybe not learning to code, but designers should still appreciate the tools that engineers are using, and engineers should also appreciate the tools and the workflows that designers are using too.
Right.
Which
Yeah.
any good company, any good, especially startups, honestly, just because there's less bureaucracy, less barriers. I think startups really excel in that. I don't know how it is at big
Mhm.
companies, and I'll be interested to know how often engineers talk with designers at companies like Microsoft or Google.
I think it depends. Some of those companies do have really great design systems that focus on
Mm-hmm.
accessibility and a lot of other aspects that maybe we can't think about. So we just kind of piggy bank on off of that.
Mm-hmm.
But building design systems and building, for that matter, really good design systems is a very
Right.
hard aspect to do, right? So if you're using, like, for example, Tailwind, realistically, to a designer, you have like infinite colors, right? But for Tailwind, you have finite colors because you need to make sure all these colors work well
Yeah.
with each other out of the box. So to
Yes.
me, take the science out of this, or yeah, they take the art and just use the science as a designer and just see that, okay, these are the constraints. It would be harder to like redesign our whole color system because realistically somebody has already kind of optimized on that for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Piggy bank off things that have already been built, that have been built well, right? Don't
Yes.
try to reinvent the wheel for something that has already been built.
Yes. As you just said, great artist steal. Good artist
Yeah.
steal.
Yeah, great
Good and great.
artists. Yeah.
Okay.
The saying is good artists copy, great artists steal, right?
Oh.
So yeah, it's
Ooh.
it's that same equivalent. Yeah.
Where's that from?
Oh, it's some like anonymous, like general thing that most like
Yeah.
artist people say. Like it's kind of corny, but like it's a very common saying.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. I will steal more then. I will steal everything from food in the kitchen to design to art to maybe some money. We'll see.
Yeah.
But okay.
Anyways,
Well,
this was a good talk. I think we're done. It was good.
yes. Good talk. And yes, we did a little bit of design, a little bit of some technical stuff, a little bit of some broader things. We hit a lot of notes today, I think. And I
Yeah.
guess, we will see everyone next week.
Yep.
Yep.
See you next week. Okay,
See you guys.
bye.